It began on an ordinary evening, the kind that feels so familiar you stop paying attention to the details. The house was quiet except for soft music playing from my phone and the gentle sound of rain against the windows. I remember thinking how rare that calm had become in my life. Marriage had taught me routine, not peace, and on that night I was simply grateful for something that felt light. We were sitting across from each other, laughing over a harmless game, the kind you play to pass time without thinking too deeply. Nothing about the moment felt dangerous. Nothing felt wrong. At least, not at first. I noticed the shift before I understood it. A pause that lasted half a second too long. A look that lingered when it should have moved away. It made me uncomfortable in a way I could not immediately explain, and the discomfort was what frightened me most. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was tired, that my mind was filling gaps where there were none. I had always been good at explaining things away, especially when the truth felt inconvenient. We continued talking, continued laughing, but something invisible had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with a tension I could not name. I became aware of myself in a way I had not been in years, of how close we were sitting, of how easily silence fell between us. None of it crossed a visible line, and yet I felt as though I had already stepped somewhere I should not be. When the game ended, I should have stood up. I should have changed the subject, created distance, done anything to break the moment. Instead, I stayed. That choice, small as it seemed, would echo louder than I could have imagined. Later, alone in my room, I replayed the evening again and again, searching for the exact second things shifted. I could not find it. All I knew was that something had awakened, and once awake, it refused to be ignored. 2. In the days that followed, I became painfully aware of how easily the mind betrays itself. I told myself nothing had happened because, technically, nothing had. There were no touches to confess, no words spoken aloud that could be repeated as evidence. And yet, every time I thought back to that evening, my chest tightened with guilt. I had crossed a line that did not exist on the surface, but felt very real beneath it. We began to notice each other more. Not deliberately, not obviously, but in subtle ways that felt almost accidental. A glance held for a moment too long. A conversation that drifted into personal territory before either of us pulled it back. Each interaction felt like standing at the edge of something forbidden, convincing myself I could look without falling. What frightened me most was how easily I justified it. I told myself I was lonely. I told myself marriage changes people, that feeling unseen was normal, that needing attention did not make me a bad person. These thoughts wrapped around my conscience like a soft blanket, muting the warnings I knew I should be listening to. I began to understand that infidelity does not begin with desire alone, but with permission, the quiet permission we give ourselves to feel what we know we should resist. Sleep became difficult. My mind wandered when it should have been still. I found myself anticipating moments I should have avoided, replaying conversations, imagining words that had never been said. The worst part was the secrecy. No one else noticed the war happening inside me. To the world, I was unchanged. Only I knew how close I was to becoming someone I had once judged harshly. There was a moment when I almost spoke up, almost set a boundary that could have ended everything before it truly began. But fear held me back. Fear of awkwardness. Fear of truth. Fear of acknowledging something that, once named, could not be undone. And so I stayed silent, and silence became its own form of consent. 3. The line, when it was finally crossed, did not announce itself with drama. There was no sudden rush, no overwhelming passion, no scene that could be easily condemned. It happened quietly, during a conversation that drifted too close to honesty. We spoke about things we had never shared with anyone else, about disappointments, about feeling unseen in our own lives. The words felt intimate, heavier than casual conversation, lighter than confession. But they carried weight. I realized then that betrayal does not require touch. It only requires redirection of the heart. I was offering emotional space that did not belong to me alone anymore. I was listening in ways I had stopped listening elsewhere. I was choosing connection where I should have chosen restraint. The guilt that followed was immediate and sharp, cutting through every excuse I had built. After that night, nothing felt the same. Every interaction carried the knowledge of what had been acknowledged without being spoken aloud. I began to withdraw, not because the feelings had disappeared, but because they had become undeniable. Distance felt safer than temptation, yet even distance hurt. It reminded me of what I had allowed to grow unchecked. I started to see myself differently. Not as a victim of circumstance, not as someone who had simply been caught off guard, but as an active participant in my own moral collapse. That realization was both painful and clarifying. I could no longer pretend innocence. I could no longer hide behind silence. The fear of consequences loomed larger than the desire itself. Fear of discovery, yes, but also fear of who I was becoming. I understood then that even if nothing more ever happened, something irreversible already had. Trust, once fractured internally, does not heal easily. And I was the one who had caused the fracture. 4. The end did not come with confrontation or exposure. It came with decision. I chose distance, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. I chose to sit with the discomfort instead of chasing relief. Ending something that was never fully begun felt strange, like mourning a loss no one else could see. But the grief was real, and so was the lesson. I spent a long time reflecting on how quietly everything had unfolded. How easily I had stepped from harmless interaction into emotional betrayal without realizing how far I had gone. Infidelity, I learned, is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like understanding, like comfort, like being seen. And that is what makes it so dangerous. I do not tell this story to excuse myself. I tell it because silence allows patterns to repeat. Because people deserve to know that boundaries matter long before they are visibly broken. I carry the weight of that experience with me still, not as punishment, but as reminder. A reminder that integrity is tested in moments no one else witnesses. Nothing dramatic followed, but something meaningful changed. I became more aware of my choices, more honest with myself about my needs, and more careful with the trust placed in me. Some mistakes do not leave scars others can see, but they shape you all the same. This is a true story not because of what happened, but because of what nearly did. And sometimes, that is where the real truth lives.